Today you guys are going to be working on your watercolor practice. Now on Canvas, there is a drawing on my board already set up. Currently just drawing it out. You have 5 areas. Each one is going to be a different aspect of watercolor techniques. Please bear with me. The camera does autofocus throughout the presentation. The first one is going to be wet on wet, wet on dry. Marks split into 8 squares, layering split in half, and paint lifting. This one is split into 4. So you're going to have lots of water on one half and lots or less water on the other half so that you can see the difference between different absorbency rates. The other half is where you can write down notes as you are following along. Watercolor comes in a variety of different sizes. There are small packs that are travel size. This one here is Crayola. Most of you are used to seeing Crayola or watercolor in this format where there are about 8 colors. It usually comes with a brush, and the lid is considered the palette. So this one here is a set of 48. It is very similar to the one that I had recommended that you purchase from Amazon. Here is a travel set. It's much smaller, has less colors. I do have a variety of options. This one was found in a clearance bin, but it is an easy travel set. This one has more colors. It's also a travel set. I do quite a bit of painting on my own, which is why all of my palettes are currently dirty. So the one on the left-hand side that is round is the one that I will demonstrate with. Now you'll notice in the center of this one, the green one is divoted. That is because I use this a lot. You should not be digging into your paint. You only need to activate your watercolor with water and just gently brush your paintbrush across the top of it. There's no reason to dig into the paint. Otherwise, you could end up making it very sticky on your landscape painting, and you don't want this. You want your artwork to be worked on in layers because it's meant to be translucent. Translucent means that you can see through it. Otherwise, it would be very opaque, and you don't want that. Now, white in a watercolor set is not necessary. So here you can see that it is worked on in layers. The white that I'm pointing out is very opaque. It doesn't work the same as white acrylic paint. It does not cover. You can see that you can't see through it. It doesn't mix well with other colors. It just changes the opacity. So if you're trying to do a highlight, you need to pre-plan those because you need to work from light to dark. So here's another example. This is an artist one. This one's closest to the one that I recommended. It's just a different type. It's meant for me to be able to remove the watercolor and rearrange it however I want. If you have the watercolor tubes, you use it differently. This is an aqua brush. You will not be putting water into it. I have not yet learned how to control the water in a way that I could teach you how to control it. So I'm just going to teach you how to use it traditionally. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to get these out of the way. So I'm going to use the one that is similar to yours. This here is a separate palette. There are 2. You could have a round one. I have the round ones here in class that you are welcome to use. Otherwise, just use the lid or the provided palette as part of your set. Now, the accordion or fan type style one, the last palette or the last part is your palette. The sponge is removable with Velcro. You just wash that out and return it to the pan. You can use it in place of paper towels. Paper towels work best. So we're going to go ahead and do wet on wet. What this means is you need to have water on your brush. So I'm going to split this into two. One is going to be a fair amount of water. Now I'm not oversaturating it. It's just enough that you can tell that it is wet and it's not oversaturated. Otherwise, it can damage your paper and you have to just let it dry before you continue working on it. So one way to do wet on wet is to put down water first, or if you have a wet color layer, this can be considered a wet on wet technique. But we're just going to use it as if I'm just starting out. This is where you will do a lot of your flat skies or the first layer of almost everything on your landscape. So to activate your pigment, you just need to add water to your pan, which is just off screen for me. You also need to then add water to the side. You just need to pick up water with your paintbrush. The more water you have, the lighter it's going to be. So right now, this is a very light blue, and it doesn't have as much pigment as if I were to touch the pan first. So I'm adding a little bit more. Once you have the value that you want, you can go ahead and start marking your paper. So here in the very wet area, I have touched the edge. The pigment will go where you have water. So you'll notice on the edges of this water well, they're soft. So the difference between wet on wet and wet on dry is although they are both flat washes, you will end up with soft edges on a wet on wet. It'll also generally be lighter. Another thing that you can do on a wet on wet technique is you can have two or more colors on top of each other, and it creates a starburst effect where they bleed into each other. To create this lighter blended effect, you do need to move your brush back and forth. So it's bleeding out into each other, creating a starburst texture. So it's not just pure red now, it's blending. So you have a little bit of areas that are a little bit more violet based. So you'll see here in the sky how I used a flat wash, and part of the sand is a flat wash, but underneath the textured areas, such as the rock and the water, there's a flat wash under it, and I've let the wash dry before adding a layer on top of it. So this area is dry enough, so it's still wet, but you'll see that there's not as much bleeding happening. So I'm trying to create a flat wash by bringing the color around and trying to get rid of the texture that's left behind. Generally, if you go in one direction and then another direction, it helps. If you're using watercolor that is powdered, they're usually the round watercolor pans. They're cheap. There's no way to make it completely smooth because it uses or leaves behind a powdered based solution. So there's not much you can do. Now, wet on dry is a straight wet paintbrush onto dry area. So the less water in your brush, you'll notice on the edges where I had less pigment, less water, it has a texture to it. And that is because of the less amount of water on my brush. So you can control that with a paper towel and drying your brush. When you are changing colors, you do want to rinse your brush out in between and dry it with the paper towel. It's still going to be damp. It's just not going to be super saturated. So this is a close-up of it. And you can see the difference between the two edges. Because things need to dry in between, areas, I'm going to go ahead and put down a wash in certain spaces so that they can go ahead and dry, and we're going to move on to other areas. Now, you do need to fill your entire space. I know I did not, and that was for the sake of demonstration, like for quick, um, so that you guys could work in class. So I'm just picking up color to add to my well. Periodically, you do need to add paint back into your watercolor or water well wherever you have put this diluted area. The more water, the lighter it's going to be. The less water, the darker it's going to be, or the more pigmented it's going to be. You never want to mix your color straight on the pan. Otherwise, you're going to have to clean your palette pan. You'll see in the white area that I accidentally picked up a little bit of gray in it. And I would just have to go back and clean it at a later time. So I'm going to go ahead and add my washes so that they can dry while we work on another area. With watercolor, you're going to want to work around your piece as you go through, and you do need to work light to dark, so your highlights need to be pre-planned. Otherwise, you'll have to darken other values so that those lighter areas will pop forward. Now, you're welcome to use whatever color you want. I'm just asking the class what colors they would like me to use, but it is your discretion. So while we let those dry, we're going to go ahead and look at paint lifting. Now, I did forget to tell you about the brushes. So there's flat brushes, which is the rectangular square ones, and then there are the round brushes. So the round ones, the more pressure you put, the bigger the line, and the more broad the stroke. With the flat ones, you can use it in two ways. I've been mostly using it as a flat area, and then you can use the side of the brush, like the side of the tip, to be able to make thinner lines if you drag it sideways. The more you use it, the more frayed it's going to be. But if you, as I was demonstrating earlier, if you wet it, you're able to shape it with your fingers. So here I'm demonstrating how you draw the flat brush on its side instead of straight up and down. So let's go back to paint lifting. So before you tell me, oh, Miss West, I messed it up and I threw it away because it was ruined. There is a way to help lift in quote unquote erase in watercolor. It'll lighten the area. It's not going to fully erase it, especially if it's dry. But I'll show you two different ways. You can use this for effects. So if you're trying to make clouds, you would put down your sky wash and then lift out your clouds. And then you can layer on top of that so that you get those fluffy rain clouds. So in the top one is going to be very wet. The wetter it is, the more you're going to have lift off. So it'll create a lighter area. So there's two ways you can do this. You can do this with a paintbrush, or you can do this with paper towel. The bottom area I'm going to let dry as I work on the top area. So it'll still be damp, but not as much. You go to lift with a paintbrush, you do need to clean it and dry it as much as possible, and then you can start pulling up the color. You will periodically go back and forth drying it because you are picking up water. So this is very faint. This can create subtle highlights. Or you can go back in with a paper towel. The more absorbent the item you use, the better. It'll lift, but you can use this to go in and now make clouds. So this area is still too damp. We'll come back to it. So you can see here that I've done clouds across the top using the lifting method. It was very faint when I took this picture, so it didn't need to be the fluffy clouds that we normally see. So now I've gone back in and I'm starting to add a little bit. And it's just a layering process. And you'll see that I'll go back with the paper towel to remove a little bit more so that you end up with a slight shadow in between. So then you have almost a shadow effect. I know it's hard to see with the way that the camera has focused, but you can kind of see it. So the other area is dry enough now that it is less water. So we can start lifting the paint. So on one side, I'm using a paintbrush, a paper towel. So you see it almost didn't do anything. And on this side, a dry paintbrush isn't doing anything. But what you can do is go back with water and it will lift a little bit. So it did a little with the paintbrush on this side. So I'm going to use the red section of my wet on wet to show you since it is completely dry. So if it is completely dry, you can go back with water. You can always reactivate dry watercolor, even on a palette, and then you lift it. So it lightened it a little bit, but it'll be just enough that you can go back and layer on top of it if need be, if you need it to hide it. Otherwise, it creates a texture. So now we're going to go ahead and do marks. So I'm labeling them stippling, hatching, and cross hatching. And scumbling is the last one. Marks, you can use the same color or a different color. Just keep in mind that you're going to see both. So right now this isn't dark enough, so I'm going to grab another little bit of green and make a darker green. And the further apart your marks with scumbling, the more of that light color will show through. And I'm kind of just twisting the paintbrush around, going back and forth, picking up more color. And you can see that the colors are different when layered on top of another. We're just mixing a little bit. And you'll find when you go across a wet layer with wet layer, like before, it's going to bleed. And I'll demonstrate that with cross hatching. So I'm using the side of my brush And depending on how much pressure you put down, it'll make smaller ones or darker ones. I mean, smaller ones or wider ones. You can see there at the edge that I made smaller ones. And then you're going to go back over to make cross hatches. I'm just grabbing another color so you can see what I mean by that it bleeds. So if you want it to be distinct layers of hatching, you need to let a layer dry before going over it. So here you'll see what I mean by it's bleeding. So I added a little red into it and it's starting to bleed into the other color. So if you use less water, you'll be able to control your mark making. It's not something that you can really rush. So if you want there to be distinct marks and texture, you will need to let the layer dry. So then for hatching and cross hatching, hatching and stippling, I'm going to use smaller things. You'll see here in the green area on the upper right, I use stippling, and you'll see hatching in the ocean on top of a flat layer. And then I have a bit of scumbling in the rocks. I'm going to switch to the round brush now. And depending on how much pressure you put, it'll make broader or smaller strokes. It'll always be thicker on one. And you see I'm trying to get a better grip for it to make smaller and smaller. If you hold the brush as straight up and down as possible instead of tilted, you'll get thinner brushes. Unfortunately, the phone was too close for me to be able to do that on the color side. And then stippling is the same. If you use the edge of the brush, it'll be more like check marks. The tip of the brush is a little bit more round. It's not as crisp as a normal like paint pen or marker and things like that. So it will have a bit of feathering to it. But you can use this texture for leaves, in rocks. It just depends on where you need it. And much like value, the closer your marks, the less you'll see. Here you'll see I have stippling close together in the rocks as well as the leaves. You'll also notice on the fish that it has stippling as well as part of the coloring for it. So it can be used in a variety of ways. And unlike value, you're not creating the value with it. It's just a layering effect. The ducks have hatching. I have hatching on the heron. There's stippling on the previous picture. So the reason that these are all so small is I travel and paint. You guys will be doing your entire sketchbook page, not such a small painting, as you're not traveling at this moment with it. So now we're going to do the layering. This one's going to be 2 or 3 different ones. You're going to layer with the same color so that you can see by making it darker, by layering with the same color. And this can create a shadow, but it's not a deep shadow. A more natural shadow is not made with black. It's made with the color plus a little bit of blue, since you're seeing it through the atmosphere, and a very tiny touch of black mixed together on your palette. This way it grays down the tone to create a more natural shadow. And right now you'll see that I'm blending down the edge so that it's not very harsh. You can see the difference between the two edges. The left hand has been blended down with just water, and the right hand side has not been blended down. So it's your discretion of what you need. If you don't want an area to pop forward, you need to blend down an area or blend down the edge. So right now I'm trying to pick up a little bit of black and a little bit of blue to mix into the green I was using. You only need to touch the bare tip of your brush to the black. I even mixed it to the side so I didn't bring a whole lot of pigment. So this should work quite well for me. And then I'm adding to it. You can see that the tone is different. And I'm not going to blend this edge. There's no need for me to show you, but you can see the difference between the two. And I can go back into the lighter green if I need to brighten it up with yellow. And you'll see here in the rocks where that natural shadow comes in, where I have both of them happening, where I've just used the same color versus the natural shadow. So here I'm going to layer a color on top of a color to create another color. So I'm currently using a dry, wet on dry, and I'm adding a little bit water because it was a little too dark. So you'll notice that I'm fading that blue down so that you can see the difference between the two of putting the blue on top of the green. Do keep in mind what colors you're layering. If I were to mix red and green, it would create a brown color. So if that is your intention, go for it. But if that was not your intention, do keep in mind you can still lift it if need be. And that is the basic techniques. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. If you're unsure of how to do something, you can test it somewhere else. You don't have to do it straight on top of your project. There are plenty of books in or pages in your book.